Melisandre entered Stannis Baratheon's life when he was already consumed by frustration and isolation. Unlike Robert Baratheon, who inspired loyalty through charisma, Stannis ruled through discipline and fear. He believed the realm had never respected him properly, and Melisandre immediately recognized that weakness. Instead of simply offering military advice, she offered something far more dangerous: certainty. She convinced Stannis that every hardship in his life was proof that he had been chosen for a greater destiny. Through prophecy and religion, she reframed his bitterness into purpose. What made Melisandre so powerful was her ability to control the interpretation of events. Victories became signs from the Lord of Light, while failures became tests of faith. This allowed her influence to survive almost any situation. Stannis slowly stopped questioning whether her advice was morally right and focused only on whether it aligned with destiny. The more he accepted her worldview, the less independent his judgment became. Melisandre transformed political decisions into sacred acts, making disagreement feel almost sinful. The assassination of Renly Baratheon marked a major turning point in their relationship. Whether Stannis fully understood the horror of what had happened or not, the event permanently connected his rise to Melisandre's supernatural power. Fear spread through Dragonstone after Renly's death, and many who once doubted Melisandre became terrified of her abilities. That fear strengthened her authority. Stannis began relying on her not just for spiritual guidance, but for confidence itself. Melisandre also understood Stannis's emotional insecurity better than anyone else. Stannis spent his entire life feeling overshadowed by Robert and ignored by the realm. Melisandre countered those feelings by convincing him he was Azor Ahai Reborn, a legendary hero destined to save the world from darkness. That prophecy gave Stannis the validation he had never received from family or followers. It transformed his ambition into something almost religious. As Melisandre's influence grew, Stannis became increasingly isolated from traditional allies. Men like Davos Seaworth warned him about the dangers of blind faith, but Davos appealed to conscience, while Melisandre appealed to destiny. In times of war, certainty often becomes more attractive than morality. Stannis trusted Melisandre because she removed hesitation from his decisions. She made every sacrifice feel necessary for a greater cause. The burning of the Seven at Dragonstone symbolized how deeply Melisandre had reshaped Stannis's identity. He was no longer simply a lawful claimant, fighting for the throne. Under Melisandre's influence, he began viewing himself as the chosen protector of humanity itself. That transformation changed the way both his followers and enemies saw him. To many across Westeros, Stannis stopped looking like a king and started looking like a fanatic driven by prophecy and fire. Stannis Baratheon's personality made him uniquely vulnerable to Melisandre's influence from the very beginning. Unlike impulsive rulers who constantly shifted loyalties and beliefs, Stannis committed himself completely once he accepted something as truth. He valued discipline, duty, and consistency above almost everything else. Melisandre understood that perfectly. She did not need to manipulate him every single day, because once she convinced him that her visions came from a higher power, Stannis's own rigid nature trapped him inside that belief system. Admitting she was wrong would also mean admitting that many of his own decisions had been built on false faith, and Stannis was not the kind of man who handled personal failure easily. The shadow assassination of Renly Baratheon permanently changed the relationship between Stannis and Melisandre. Even if Stannis tried to emotionally distance himself from what happened, he understood that Renly's death had opened his path toward the throne. That created a dangerous psychological bond. Once someone benefits from an extreme act committed in their name, they often become more attached to the ideology behind it, because accepting the horror of the act would force them to confront unbearable guilt. Melisandre's power therefore became tied directly to Stannis's own sense of legitimacy. The more he depended on the results of her actions, the harder it became to morally separate himself from her methods. Melisandre also gave Stannis something he had spent his entire life searching for: significance. Stannis always lived in the shadow of other men. Robert was loved by the people, Renly attracted loyalty naturally, and even Ned Stark inspired admiration through honor. Stannis rarely received affection or emotional validation from anyone around him. Most followed him out of obligation, rather than devotion. Melisandre completely changed that emotional dynamic by convincing him he was Azor Ahai reborn, the chosen warrior destined to save humanity from darkness. For the first time in his life, Stannis was not merely a neglected brother or a bitter claimant to the throne. He became the center of a cosmic prophecy. That emotional validation made Melisandre's influence far deeper than ordinary political manipulation. She was not simply advising Stannis on military strategy or religion. She was redefining his identity. Every hardship he suffered became evidence that he was carrying a sacred burden. Every sacrifice became proof of his commitment to humanity's survival. Melisandre transformed Stannis's resentment into purpose, and purpose is incredibly difficult to abandon once it becomes tied to a person's sense of self-worth. Without Melisandre's prophecies, Stannis would be forced to confront the painful possibility that he was simply another ambitious lord fighting a brutal war for power. The Battle of the Blackwater should have destroyed Melisandre's authority over Stannis, yet in many ways it strengthened it. Stannis suffered a devastating defeat, despite believing he was destined to win. But Melisandre's worldview was designed to survive failure. Instead of interpreting defeat as evidence that her visions were false, she framed it as proof that greater faith and harsher sacrifices were required. This made her influence extremely resilient. Victories confirmed prophecy, while defeats became tests of belief. Stannis slowly adopted this mindset completely. Every setback pushed him deeper into dependence, because abandoning faith after sacrificing so much would emotionally destroy him. Davos Seaworth represented the only consistent challenge to Melisandre's control, because Davos appealed to Stannis' humanity rather than his destiny. Davos reminded him about justice, mercy, and the cost ordinary people paid during war. But Davos's arguments required Stannis to confront uncertainty and moral doubt, while Melisandre offered clarity. In desperate times, leaders often prefer certainty over conscience, because conscience creates hesitation. Melisandre eliminated hesitation from Stannis's thinking by reframing cruelty as necessity. Burning unbelievers, sacrificing innocents, and embracing fear all became acceptable because they were supposedly part of a larger war against darkness itself. Melisandre's influence also grew stronger because Stannis became increasingly isolated politically. Many noble houses distrusted the Lord of Light and feared Melisandre's growing authority at Dragonstone. As allies abandoned Stannis or kept their distance, his dependence on Melisandre intensified. Isolation is one of the most dangerous conditions for any ruler because it allows a single trusted advisor to dominate their worldview completely. Stannis had very few people he truly respected, and Melisandre ensured she became one of the most important voices in his life. The fewer supporters he retained, the more emotionally valuable her unwavering belief became. The harsh northern campaign further strengthened Melisandre's hold over Stannis. Hunger, freezing weather, exhaustion, and collapsing morale created an atmosphere where prophecy became psychologically irresistible. When people feel surrounded by suffering and uncertainty, they often search for larger meaning to justify their pain. Melisandre excelled at providing that meaning. She framed the brutal conditions not as evidence of failure, but as proof that the final battle between light and darkness was approaching. Stannis increasingly interpreted suffering itself as confirmation of destiny. That mindset made him willing to endure and justify horrors that would once have seemed unthinkable. The tragedy surrounding Shireen Baratheon demonstrated the horrifying endpoint of Melisandre's influence over Stannis. Whether viewed through the lens of the television adaptation or the darker implications within the books, the symbolism remains devastating. Stannis reached a point where prophecy outweighed fatherhood itself. His belief in destiny became stronger than his natural human instincts. Melisandre convinced him that sacrifice was not cruelty but duty, and that the greater the sacrifice, the greater the proof of commitment to the cause. This is the danger of ideological fanaticism. Personal morality slowly becomes secondary to the mission. What made Melisandre especially dangerous was that she genuinely believed in what she preached. She was not a simple liar manipulating Stannis for amusement or greed. She truly believed the Great Other was coming, and that Azor Ahai needed to rise against the darkness. That sincerity gave her enormous persuasive power because her conviction felt authentic. Fanatics often become more convincing than ordinary manipulators precisely because they completely believe their own worldview. Stannis sensed that certainty and mistook it for truth. Her confidence became contagious. In the end, Stannis could never fully escape Melisandre's influence because she controlled more than his strategy or politics. She controlled the narrative through which he understood his entire existence. She transformed his suffering into destiny, his ambition into prophecy, and his brutality into sacrifice. Even when events contradicted her visions, Stannis continued clinging to her worldview because abandoning it would force him to confront unbearable truths about himself and the terrible choices he had made. Melisandre did not merely influence Stannis Baratheon. She reshaped the meaning of his life itself.